Hello, I'm glad you could join my presentation on Datatable, a flow screen component. And thank you for having me and giving me the ability to present again at this amazing conference. Proud of everything that I see here and the wonderful agenda that we have. So let's sit back, relax, and learn a little more about what Datatable can do for you in a flow screen. My name is Eric Smith. I'm a technical architect for Rafter One. We're a Salesforce consulting partner. We're primarily based in US, Canada, and India. We have clients and employees throughout the world. I'm a Salesforce MVP, hold 6 Salesforce certifications. I've been in the technology industry for over 45 years. I've had my own business. I've worked in sales. I've worked in project management. I've worked in development. I've worked in administration and kind of a little bit here, there, and everywhere. So that's a pretty good real world experience. I'm based in Portland, Maine in the US, and you can reach me on Twitter, email, LinkedIn. I have my contact information here on the screen. I always love hearing from people like you and what you're doing with Salesforce, how you may be using some of these components, and what some of your wonderful, unique use cases may be. So why did I create a data table component for Flow? Well, the reasons were fairly straightforward. When I first started working with Salesforce Flow, I used a component, built-in component called Dynamic Record Choice. Dynamic Record Choice allows you on a Flow screen to present a list of records, and you can display a single field from each of those records, and you can allow the user to choose one or more of those records, which you can then use later on in your flow. As you can see from what I have displayed on the screen right here, sometimes that data can get a little compacted, a little messy, sometimes hard to read. In this particular case, I wanted to present more information to the user to make their selection than what you might normally see with just a normal single field out of that record. So what I did is I created a formula field. I took information from 4 other fields and kind of concatenated it all together with the values of those fields, some special characters, spaces, everything else to try and get as much information on that screen as I could possibly present. Now, the problem with that, and as you saw on the screen, sometimes that can be a little hard to read. And I wanted the ability to organize that data into columns like a list view or in a table format. So that gave me the idea and the reasoning behind why I wanted to create this component. As you can see on this screen, I've actually have 4 different data tables here for the user to select from. And we can see that the information now is spread out. I can display multiple fields, it's organized, it's lined up, and it's a little easier for the user to see and interact with. Some of the other benefits you get from using a data table, it does give you that cleaner display, more organized, formatted display of information. One of the benefits of using the data table component is you also give your user the ability to interact with that data, interact with that table. They can do things to what they see on the screen and have it be under their own control. They can sort the data they see by individual columns. They can filter the data and see just certain records based on certain filter criteria. They can manually adjust the width of individual columns to show more or show less information. They can turn text wrapping on and off. This is all under the user's control. They can select single records. They can select multiple records. And they can even do inline editing. You can present a list of records, have the user go into individual fields, make changes, take those edited records, pass them back to the flow, and then not only act upon selected records, but you can also act upon the edits or the changes that they may want to make to some of those records. So let's just run through an example here. We'll show you on the screen the old way of doing things versus how it's done with the data table. As we can see here, I could select those multiple records by using checkboxes. I could do individual record selections using radio buttons. I can manually go in and change the width of those columns. I can turn text wrapping on and off if I want to. I can sort columns into an ascending or descending sequence. So there's a lot of things I can do with that data while I'm looking at it on the screen to help me pick and choose and either make my selections or better understand what I'm trying to display or what you're trying to display in your screen flow. So how hard is it to actually build a flow and use the data table component? Well, I'd like to demonstrate that as well. We're going to start from scratch. We're going to build a screen flow that's going to get a group of records and display them in a data table. And we're going to go and run through that process right now. I'll start by saying I want to create a new flow. I'm going to select a screen flow in this case. That's where the data table component resides. And I personally prefer auto layout, so I'm going to use that. And the first thing I want to do is I want to get some records that I want to display in my data table. So I'm going to use the standard get records component. You can build out your collection of records any way you want, but this is the simple, straightforward way of doing it. This is a dev org, so I have just a few records in there. I'm not going to filter them at all here. I'll just say, go get all records, automatically store all that data. Now I'm going to add a screen to my flow. I will give the screen a name, and now under the custom components, I'm going to find my data table component and drag that onto the screen. I'll give the component an API name, and then I'm going to say, what object, what type of records do I want to work with here? So I'm going to say, well, I have account records I want to display, and here's the collection variable that holds those. And now I'm going to do a little bit of magic here and use what I call my custom column configuration wizard. And I'm going to pick and choose the fields that I want to show in that data table. So on the left, I have a list of all of the fields of the account object. And on the right-hand column, I'm going to show the ones that I've selected. And I can add or remove fields from that table or column, and I can even change the order. Which order do I want them to appear on the table? And now we're going to see a sample data table with those fields from that object. And now I can go in and interact with that table. And while I'm interacting with this table, I'm actually defining the attributes of or the parameters that are going to be used when configuring the data table. What is it going to look like when the user runs the flow? So I can set my column widths. I can pick icons to put in front of a column header. I can change the labels on the column headers. I can turn editing and filtering on and off by column. I can change my alignment. I can do left, right, center alignment. And so I can interact with this sample table as much as I want to get it to look the way that I want it to look in my flow. So I can actually see right on the screen, what is this table going to look like when I run my flow? So once I have all of these attributes assigned, I click done here. We exit out of this particular column wizard, and I can go on and I can set some other attributes for the table as well. I could give it a header if I want to. I could define different behavior characteristics. Am I going to select single rows, multiple rows, no rows? Do I want links to be clickable? There's a number of different things that you can do to really fine tune this component to work the way you want it to work in your flow. So once all of these attributes are defined, I say this is good. Let's save my flow, run my flow, and let's see what we get. So we're going to call this demo flow. We're going to save that, and then we'll go ahead and run this. I think my demo org is a little slow today. I apologize. It's just going to take a moment for this flow to start up. This isn't normal behavior that you would see, obviously, in a production org. So here we go. And here's the table that with the account records, exactly the way I defined it when I was in the flow builder. But you also see, as the user running the flow, I still have that control over what I want to see. I can now go in and do some filtering, sorting, changing column widths, any number of things, and really interact with that table. So you have some really powerful capability when you're configuring the component, as well as putting some of that power and capabilities into the hand of your users when you're there running the flow where you've installed this or defined this component. So one of the real powerful capabilities here, and what we saw when we were setting this up, is using something called a custom property editor. When a developer creates a component designed to be used in a flow or on a flow screen, typically, if they don't have a custom property editor, what you're going to see is what we see here on the left-hand column is you will see all of the attributes that the developer has exposed to the person using the component and building a flow, the flow builder. And they really can't do much else other than display those attributes in alphabetical order. And it's up to the user to go back and forth with the documentation and pick and choose and put the right values in there. Whereas in the right-hand column, you see with a custom property editor, we actually have, as a developer, have built a whole nother component that kind of wraps around the components that you're using in your flow and gives you an easier way to interact with the flow builder and pick and choose what attributes you want when you are configuring the component to be used in your flow. As you can see here, I have various sections. I'm defining the data source, the object, and the records. I can define the formatting by picking the columns and the header and a few other things. I can add or leave off a border. I can pick the maximum number of records I want to display. And then we get into things like table behavior and some of the advanced options. Also in a custom property editor, as you as the user are going through configuring the component, I can expose and hide certain attributes based on what other selections are. Just like a flow or a Lightning record page can have conditional visibility, a custom property editor can also have conditional visibility and turn on and turn off certain attributes depending upon what other selections are. So this allows me to try and make this component as general purpose as possible, to fill as many use cases as possible, but also give you an easier way of configuring that component, really wrapping your hands around all that power and capability that we see there. And I'm going to pause here because it looks like my camera turned off. Okay, hopefully we can edit that pause out of there. I don't know why the camera went away, but we're back. So we're going to continue on. We were talking about the custom property editor. Now, in this particular custom property editor, I did a really interesting trick is I embedded another screen flow. And this is what I call my column configuration wizard. So this is a flow that runs inside of the flow builder, running inside of another flow. It's using the component that we're configuring to display that component and allow you to interact with it and have that set some of the attributes. So it's kind of like a little bit of a convoluted flow inside a flow inside a flow, but it really does the trick, and it gives you hopefully an easier way to set up those columns and set up that table. So that's the button that we see here to configure the columns. And we saw as we went through that, you can pick and choose your list of fields, or even type in the API names manually if you want. I'm giving you that selection. We have a list of all of the fields by field label on one side, our selected fields on the other. We add, remove, we reorder as we go through those. And then as we saw, we get into the actual sample table where we can interact with that table and do things like, okay, I'm going to set my column headings. I'm going to set my labels, my icons. I'm going to do my column widths, do my alignments, do any number of things I can turn on, which fields and columns I'm going to be able to edit, which ones I'm going to be able to filter. So all of that is done by interacting with the actual component that we're configuring the data table component. Not only can we use this wizard to set up all of those attributes, I also give you the ability to, once you've configured a data table, you can actually save that configuration. You can give it a name, you can save that, and then later on, if you're building another flow or even in the same flow, where you want a table to be configured exactly the same way, have the same column headings, order, column widths, all of that, you don't have to reconfigure it manually each and every time you want to make a table look like that in a flow. You can save that configuration and then load it in later, and it brings all of those attributes in for you. So this is a definite time saver here to save those column configurations. In addition to being able to display these records from various Salesforce objects, whether they're standard objects or custom objects, I've also built the capability into this data table component to display and configure your own objects, what we sometimes call Apex defined objects. So they don't have to be actual records from actual Salesforce objects. They could be something you predefine as an Apex class, or even build out in the flow manually as you're running through the flow. You can design your own objects. And I give you the ability with the various column attributes to say what those fields are, the alignments, the editing, the filters, the labels, the icons. All of that can be controlled manually and even programmatically. For example, I've put flows together where, depending upon what other actions take place in a flow before it gets to the point where it's going to display my data table, I'm actually picking one set of fields or a different set of fields, and it could display a totally different table, even though it's a single data table component on a single screen. What those attributes are can actually even be set and controlled by what happens in the flow. You can even build from scratch in a text variable or a string variable all of the information you want to display in that data table. Using what we call JSON format, you can build out a collection of records with field names and field values and have that be built in the flow and then displayed in that formatted data table later on. I've used some of that capability. This is a utility I wrote a few years ago where this is before Salesforce had built in the ability to put a custom list view out there for process builders and for flows. I wanted the ability to create my own list view and display that on the screen. And not only did I want to display those flows or process builders, I wanted the ability to select some of those, in this case, inactive flows and or inactive process builders, and go ahead and batch delete these inactive flows or inactive process builders. This was an interesting idea, especially with Process Builder. If you try and delete an inactive process builder, it is a long, drawn-out manual process. When you bring up the view, you find your process builder, you find the version you want, you click on it, you delete it, then you wait and wait and wait, confirm it gets deleted, and you go back and start the whole process all over again for each and every individual inactive flow or process builder that you want to delete. Using the data table, using this capability of defining my own objects, I was able to build this into a utility, into a flow that does this all for you automatically. And the reason I needed to use this Apex defined or custom defined object to do that is the fields I wanted to display in this data table actually came from 3 different objects. So I'm pulling data from multiple objects to present in a single list of records or a single list of rows in a data table. So it's powerful enough to allow me to do this type of display and build out this particular type of data table. You also have the capability with this data table to display some pretty interesting formatting. I can take advantage of Salesforce themes and do colors and backgrounds and shading and add icons to field values. I could use rich text, long text fields, URLs. I could even do images and display those images as rich text in my data table. So there's a lot of very interesting things you can do with the user interface. So we have a lot we can do with displaying and selecting, editing, and you can even create a flow with the data table, say with a blank line in it, and go in and edit individual field values and use that to add records to an object. So there's a lot of power and capability in this particular component. Here's just another example of showing, again, some more things with links and URLs and images. The bottom sample here was showing on both selecting and editing field values. The data table component passes back to the flow, not just a collection of selected records, but also a collection of edited records with the changes that the user has made. So you have the ability to act upon those selections and those edits in your flow. The requirements for the data table component, pretty straightforward. It's multiple Lightning Web components that get installed. It does use 3 Apex classes that do some of the processing behind the scenes. When you install a component that has Apex classes, you do have to have a permission set, or in your profiles, give the users the ability to run or execute those Apex classes that are part of this component. And I do take advantage of a couple of the base packs that we've created on unofficialsf.com. And this is primarily to support the custom property editor. There's a lot of little things that are there when you're kind of displaying certain things, picking and choosing, that rather than making a developer like myself reinvent the wheel each and every time I create a new component, there's certain things that are reusable that are used a lot in these components. And we've built these base packs to allow somebody to just install these base packs once, and they can be used not just in my data table component, but in a lot of other components that you can find on unofficialsf.com as well. I'd like to go through some examples of some of the use cases. I've showed you a few of my own, but just some other use cases that different companies have used the data table component for. And there's a lot of them out there. The last I checked, this component has been installed in over 45,000 different unique Salesforce orgs. It is very, very widely used. It's become very popular. There's really a real need for this, which, thank goodness, this is why Salesforce has now started to come out with and release their own built-in version of a data table component. They've seen the need, the desire, the use cases that are out there, and it is important to them to have this as something that's built in. Now they're just getting started. The built-in component in the latest release is still a beta, and it's fairly limited as to what it can do. Now, over time, over future releases, they will be adding some of the additional capabilities that we see in my component, by release. They'll slowly start to add some of these things in there. But in the meantime, take advantage of the power and the capability in my component, put it to use, and see what you can build in your flows. So let's go through a few examples and see what people have done. The first example is a company that wanted to clone some records. Now, it's a custom object, kind of similar to an opportunity. It's an object they call an event, but these events had a lot of child objects associated with them. So not only did they want the ability to clone this master record, they wanted to see all of the child records that were attached to the master record and allow the user to pick and choose which ones of those child records did they want to actually clone and include with the clone record, and which ones did they want to leave out. So by using the data table component to display information from those child objects, from those child records, the user running the flow has the ability to pick and choose which records to include as part of the clone. So there's multiple data tables involved here. The user can go in and make those choices. And this is where things like filtering and sorting and other things come in, it gives them the ability to narrow that data down and find the exact records they want if they're trying to pick just a few out of a much larger sample of records. Here's another example of a data table that's being used to display some quote records. But the nice thing about the data table component is when we're displaying the primary name field for an object, in case, for example, case number, an account, the account name, and quotes, the quote number, those typically by default will display as a clickable hyperlink. So not only can we display those records, by the user could go in, and click on that field and actually be taken right to that record. Now, if you don't want that behavior, you can certainly turn that off in the data table when you are configuring the data table in the flow builder. But this is very handy and a very widely used method of allowing somebody to see a list of records and jump right to the record that they want just by using a flow with the data table component. Another ability that Flow gives you that a standard list view doesn't is that you could provide more control over the visibility and the access to Salesforce data. In this particular example, the customer didn't want to have just a list view of some of these DocuSign objects on their record page or home page because they didn't have the ability to really fine-tune the access or the control over who could or should see these records and who shouldn't. But by using the power of a flow, they had more ability to really do different decisions, look at different parameters and attributes and say which users should or should not see this data. And then by exposing these records in a data table and a screen flow, the flow is able to control whether this was going to show up on the page or not show up on the page. So a good example of how the data table component gives you, as the administrator, a little more power and capability over how you expose data to your users. This is a little more complex screen. This particular customer not only wanted to do some inline editing of some of these fields that we see here in the data table, but they also wanted the ability to select individual records and then act on those records, whether it was a more involved editing process or doing other things with those. So this particular data table is being used to display information, edit information, and then select records to be acted upon later on in the flow. This is an interesting one here. This is nothing but a static grid of static data. It's not an object, it's not records. It's just a table that the client wanted to display on a screen in a flow. And they wanted it in a formatted fashion. So how do you display formatted data? Well, you use the data table. And even though we're not using records, as you see on the bottom part of this screen, I was actually able to just build out a string variable. And I'm just adding these field names, field values manually, and just building out this table of data. And then once I've built this string, rather than passing a collection of records to the data table, I'm just passing a string, saying, here it is, here's my table, go ahead and display that table in the flow. Another interesting example is using a flow to do roll-ups and calculations for you, and then take the results of those roll-ups, those calculations, and display them in a data table in the flow. In this particular case, we're displaying information that's not records from a particular object, but it's roll-ups and results of looking at multiple records and multiple objects, putting a table together in the flow and displaying that consolidated information in a data table. Another interesting thing the admin did who built this particular flow is they did what I call kind of a pretend or faux filtering. They added a toggle switch so the user thinks they are turning a filter on and off. And what we're actually doing behind the scenes in the flow is we're displaying one of two different data tables that we've actually built in the flow. And we're just toggling one on and the other one off by hitting that toggle button. The user is interacting with the flow, thinking they're filtering something on, filtering something off. They see the data they need, and away they go. So another really interesting use case of using the data table without necessarily using regular fields and records from a standard object. So now that we've seen a few of the examples, I do just want to cover there are a few restrictions that we do want to look at. Not all data types are currently editable in my data table component. Time fields, rich text fields, encrypted fields, lookup fields, and a few others you can't edit currently. You can do date time, you can do pick list, you can do a number of all of your standard types of fields, but it's just a few that you can't. But also I have made the component usable for adaptive uses. So if somebody is visually impaired and they're using a screen reader, the data table component fully supports a screen reader. They can tab through and a screen reader will read back the contents of the individual cells. The only thing you have to do to support the screen reader capabilities, you do have to include a table header, so the screen reader knows where to go to get the data table. Another interesting capability that I've built into this along those same lines is that all of the text, standard text that you see in the data table component, whether it be an error message, a prompt, the label on a button, or a number of other things, I've set all of these up as custom labels. They're not hard-coded into the component. So that gives you the ability, using the translation workbench, to modify those to meet your own needs, whether it's translating to another language or just changing what you want some of these prompts or labels or buttons to say. So that is fully supported using translation workbench. You can configure it even further to fit your particular localized needs for data table. A couple other things to watch out for. Those links where you can click on the name field for an object and go right to the record. In order for a lookup field or a master detail field to support that display as a link and be workable as a link, when you are defining that field in the object manager, it needs to be set up as what's called reparentable, and there's a checkbox for that. And the running user needs to have edit access to the object whose records are being displayed in the data table for that link to work. Otherwise, they might just see just a record ID number rather than the name and the ability to link to the record. And then there's a few things that aren't supported due to various restrictions in Salesforce. One is geolocation fields. If you include geolocation fields in the collection of records that you're passing to the data table, currently there's a bug in Salesforce that may cause issues with the data table, so it's a good idea to leave those out. I don't recommend using the version data field if you're going to display a data table with the content version object records, because that's actually the file itself. That's the binary data for the file. So that's a lot of information that can't really be displayed in the data table and doesn't need to be processed behind the scenes in your record collections either. So it's a good idea to leave that field out. If you're doing to get records, rather than say, let Salesforce pick all of the fields, just individually pick the fields you're going to want further on in your flow or later in the data table. And there's also a interesting behavior thing in Salesforce. The standard location object cannot be accessed directly for the data table. I have written a blog post on a workaround. If you do need to display records from the location object, there is a way to do it, but you can't just access it directly. I even went and checked this on the built-in beta data table component that Salesforce has. They have the same bug or same restriction there. It just doesn't work. So just a couple things to keep in mind when you're using the data table. There's a lot of information out there too. This has been around a few years. I've made numerous enhancements to it. I still continue to support and enhance this component based on feedback from you, the users. And I've written a lot of documentation to show you how to use it, use cases, examples. There's really some interesting articles, a couple specialized ones on, say, how to use an Apex defined object with the data table, how to use both selected and edited records in your flow when you're doing both in a data table. The data table component documentation on unofficialsf.com has a wealth of information, examples, screenshots, everything else to help you learn how to use this component. There's a section on troubleshooting if you have issues when you first go to install it or use it. If you run into issues, there's some troubleshooting tips there as well. If your developers or your IT people need to take a look at a component before you install it in your org, 100% of the source code is available for you to look at. It's there, it's public. I've made it available for you to see, to learn from, to use. So you can see what I did behind the scenes to actually build this and get this to work for you. So there's a lot of information out there to take advantage of. And just my own personal view on this, as you can see with some of the power, the attributes, some of the capability behind this. When I come across a need or I have my own particular use case for something, I don't like to do a one-off. I don't like to create something that's going to fix my need. I get it done and then move on. I like to create something that I can reuse, maybe with a slightly different use case down the road, something that's configurable, that I can put other attributes in and use it differently, not just for myself, but for the rest of you as well. I do like to share these components and provide them so other use cases other than my own can take advantage of it. I figure if I have a need, somebody else is going to run into the same thing and have a similar need as well. That's where unofficialsf.com comes in. I have my own blog, my own site, but I've published a number of these components on Unofficial SF where I've done just that. I've had a need, I've created something, I've made it configurable, and then I put it out there for the rest of you to find, use, take advantage of, and hopefully come up with some pretty interesting flows for yourself. So take advantage of these resources. There's a lot more out there, and hopefully you'll find some great ways to use the data table component as well. I hope this presentation's been helpful, and I will be available on whatever online format we have for this conference to try and answer questions and provide feedback. If I'm not able to do it right now, today, live, feel free to reach out to me as well, email, Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to interact with you, answer questions, and help you along on your journey. This has been a pleasure for me to do, hopefully interesting for you to listen to. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.